Hey guys, this isn't something I usually do, but I had an interesting question on Twitter, and it was going to take me so long to answer it one tweet at a time that I thought I'd just make a video of it because it kind of fascinated me, so maybe you'll get a kick out of it too. The question was this. Ashley, you are the expert, I think. Would a Victorian sword swallower use a medieval sword from Jamrach's, and could it be used two-handed in a fight if he is wearing handcuffs? Well, there are a lot of components to that question. The first component is you are the expert, and I am not the expert in any of those things, but I'm going to try to answer it anyway. So, first of all, Jamrach's, and I may not be pronouncing that properly, that's anglicized. If he was pronouncing it the way his father did, Jamrach, I'm going to go with Jamrach's. But he was a naturalist. He had an animal emporium in London at the end of the 19th century. And in a description from an article in the Strand magazine, 1891, the description of the back room in his emporium says, "Arms of every kind, which is not an ordinary kind, stand in corners, hang on walls, and litter the floors. Great two-handed swords of medieval date and of uncompromisingly English aspect stand amid heaps of Maori clubs, African spears, and Malay creases." So, there's the foundation of whether Mr. Jamrach would have had medieval weapons in his emporium. That sounds like he has English swords from the Middle Ages. That description specifically lists a greatsword, which is definitely not a sword that a sword swallower could have used. A greatsword is more or less a pole weapon, actually. It is meant to fight multiple opponents at once, fight in narrow alleyways, defend people in rooms against circling opponents in a melee. So that's not what a sword swallower would use. However, there are medieval swords that a sword swallower might use. The other components of this Twitter question are whether or not this sword could be used two-handed and whether or not it could be used while handcuffed. So first of all, I think we can rule out whether a sword swallower would be using an actual two-handed medieval sword. That would be something along the lines of this. This is a long sword, high Middle Ages, and you can see that the length of the blade, far too long for a sword swallower, even one far taller than I am. This sword is made for me. I'm only 5'4", and the blade is 34 inches, but that's far longer than a sword swallower could have used. And of course, this is a short version of a longsword because I'm a short longsword user. Now, it is meant to be used two-handed, and you can see with the normal grip of a longsword, perfectly fine if I were handcuffed. I wouldn't have any problem manipulating in any of the ways that are usual for a longsword to be used. But sword swallower wouldn't grab this, not if he was trying to swallow it, because, you know, it would do terrible things. There are shorter medieval swords, though. The record that I could find for sword swallowing, and I'm not an expert on that either, was 33 inches, I think, for an American sword swallower, blade length. And medieval arming swords, one-handed swords, are around 30 inches, 29 inches or so. Okay, so that would have been potentially fine. This is a practice weapon, it's not sharp, and it's not actually an arming sword. It's a Langsmesser, which means it has a longer handle, but the blade is 30 inches long, so conceivably this could have been used by a sword swallower. If this is what your sword swallowing escapee tries to grab, he's not going to have any problem using it two-handed. However, if what he uses is a medieval arming sword, the grip is going to be shorter. However, he probably could have still grabbed down across the pommel, and that wouldn't have been a problem to use the thing two-handed. Here's the thing, though. I don't think that's what would have happened. So a medieval sword has a standard cruciform hilt, and you can see it perhaps better in the longsword, right? Blade, too many swords. Blade, grip, pommel at the bottom, and quillons. The quillons are pretty standard protection for your hand. They're pretty slim protection for your hand, speaking as someone who's had my hand bashed a lot of times. But more or less what they do is the assumption is that you bind swords on the blade, and if one of them slides down, you're not going to get your fingers sliced off. As time went on and swords developed, they developed more complex hilts, right? So rather than just a straight cruciform blade, and we don't know exactly in what order these components developed, but finger rings developed so that you could grip over the quillon and protect your finger. Knuckle bows developed to protect your fingers from getting smashed from the side, and other little twiddly bits sort of grew up and connected them one over the other, so that by the Renaissance you had rapier grips, right? So they protect your hand from all sorts of angles. They still have the quillons. You can still see the remnants of the medieval cruciform hilt, right? But they also have protection above your fingers, protection over your knuckles, protection over the back of your hands. By the 19th century, the standard is basket hilts, and this starts in the 18th century too, but 19th century, like military sabers and things would have basket hilts. Now this is a fencing saber, but don't worry about that. So they would have been developed and they enclosed the hand almost entirely so that your hand was safe. But if you have a medieval sword, you don't have that. Instead, what you have is an offhand weapon, or offhand protection, shield. Commonly, a buckler. So rather than a giant, we're not talking about a big heater shield here that you would have had like a, in battle, but as a standard kind of side or companion weapon, a buckler was really handy, right? You can carry it with you, it's not too intrusive, and it would have been common to fight with both of these at once. Not this way. That doesn't do you very much good. Buckler is small, but it performs the same function as the enclosed hilt of the sword. So when you're striking, sword and buckler technique tells you hold your buckler out, right, your sword back, or strike with both at the same time, protects your hand. You can do it that way. You can do it that way. But either way, your offhand, holding your buckler, is protecting your sword hand, which is the thing presented closest to your opponent. It's the most tempting target. So, could you have fought with this sword while you were handcuffed? Well, if you know sword and buckler technique, that's no problem. You're used to putting your hand there anyway. So, let's see how it works. Not going to use my hand on the sword because I'm going to assume I've got an arming sword that has a smaller grip than this. And a one-handed sword doesn't need that kind of leverage. It's not going to be nimble that way. But if I act as though I've got an invisible buckler in my hand, and I perform all my common kind of strikes with the sword, I can go into any guard, I can do any common strikes, right? Any of those. I can strike from the back edge of the weapon, I can strike up, I can strike forward, I can thrust with it, though you wouldn't thrust very much with a short sword this short, you're getting too close to your opponent, but you might if you had to, if you were in an escaping situation. But if I pretend like I've got my invisible buckler, that's how I would use a one-handed sword with handcuffs. It doesn't impede me in any way. So the answer is, if Mr. Jamrick had an arming sword, right, that's only 30 inches or so, or less, or fewer, and if your sword swallower was familiar with sword and buckler technique, he would not be hampered at all by having handcuffs, because he would be used to keeping his hand exactly where it was supposed to be, to protect his to protect his sword hand with his buckler. So there's your answer. I don't know if it helps. I don't know if it's interesting. I know that I'm handcuffed and holding a sword, so time to go have a party.